Welcome to the Liner Podcast and Megaphone Rugby. Today I'm talking to Eugene Edding, CEO of the My Players organization, representing player welfare in South African rugby and in the news quite a bit lately. So welcome, Eugene.
Hi, Envia. Thank you for having me on the show.
Right, tell me what My Players is, because we hear about you a lot, and we heard about you especially last year when the Currie Cup was moved to a new time slot and everything else. So firstly, what is My Players and what does it stand for?
Envia, My Players is the players organization. It's firstly 100% owned by the professional rugby players in South Africa. We've got four major divisions. The one is the industrial division, where we look after the minimum employment requirements like the collective bargaining agreements and sort of everything that comes with that. The second division is our financial services division. That's where we look after their pension fund, contract insurance, medical aid. The other division is player development. There we do the psychometrical testing and we aim to help the players that they're ready for life after rugby. And the fourth division is our collective commercial rights division. That's where we aggregate all the collective commercial rights of the players into one entity, and that entity then on-sell the rights to the market, to the broadcasters, sponsors, and licensees.
It's quite a mouthful. Is it similar to a trade union, or what? How does it work?
It's a good question. It started as a trade union in the late 90s as SARPA. That's typically where player organizations start themselves and organize themselves from. But then it sort of developed and added all these other divisions, the commercial, the financial services, and the player development. So I would say trade union is a division of My Players, but it's most probably 15% or so of the daily operations of the organization. So not a major trade union focus as in the past, but it definitely started there, yes.
Well, as of any sort of trade union or collective bargaining, or where people come together to form sort of a united force, if I can call it that, to negotiate. You guys are quite powerful. I mean, you guys have to look after the players' interests, make sure they don't play too much, make sure they get paid properly, make sure the contracts are kept to. How much of an influence does My Players have at the moment? Because we saw last year, for example, because of your influence, the Currie Cup was moved to this new time slot. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say we think about ourselves as powerful. We would rather think about ourselves as a stakeholder of the industry, and we would like to be as constructive and positive stakeholder as we possibly can. That sometimes do mean that we don't agree with everything what's happening in the industry. And then you've got a debate, or you've got even an arbitration where you want a specific award. But we're very cautious in not being activists. We want to make a constructive contribution to the industry, and we regard ourselves as a stakeholder, and just like the media, commercial partners, the fan, the administrators like SARU, and then the players come in. All of those are stakeholders, and we're just one of them. And we don't solely think about the interests of the group or the players when we do take a position or a stance. We try and think of the sort of, the bigger picture and what's in the interest of the game. And sometimes it might look like that's only in the interest of the player, but our mandate from our members are very clear. Don't think about yourself as powerful. Be a constructive contributor to the industry.
Now, I want to talk about you a little bit, because obviously you're going to sit in some pretty high-powered rooms with some pretty high-powered people used to get in their way. What is your background? Are you a lawyer, or how did you end up in this position?
Yeah, I'm a lawyer, but I stopped practicing 20 years ago, so I'm not sure whether I can still call myself a lawyer. But I'm a lawyer by trade, and then I worked in financial services for about 6 or 7 years, which was very interesting. We worked in private equity, financial structuring and listings. And then, like I guess a lot of South African people, I've got a love for rugby, and I got the opportunity to join them and help them a little bit with their commercial program. And that was 15 years ago, and I jumped at that just because I like the game and I like the sport.
Yeah. But the biggest talking point at the moment in South Africa is the 12-month effective season. Firstly, how did that come about? Is that not because we moved to the URC, our Southern Hemisphere international commitments are now different to our Northern Hemisphere more domestic commitments? What's the problem? Why are we suddenly faced with a 12 months, effectively a non-stop season?
Yeah, NBA, you spot on. It started because we moved from Super Rugby to the URC, and the URC, of course, is aligned with the Northern Hemisphere calendar. So they start in July and they run all the way to May of the next year, which is an interesting concept. But then we still play our international rugby in the southern hemisphere calendar. So we're effectively playing our provincial rugby on a northern hemisphere calendar, and our international rugby on a southern hemisphere calendar, and that amounted to us playing for 12 months effectively.
So let's jump right ahead to what is the solution, or is there a solution? Is there any way that we can manage this with keeping the traditional southern hemisphere, called it greatest rivalry? That's what the next year's tour is going to be called, and still competing in the URC. I mean, the answer is obviously not just to keep playing, because something's got to give somewhere. Is the answer maybe bigger player squads? Is it more money, bigger budgets? Is it the global calendar? What's your thinking in terms of solving this problem?
Yeah, one of the CEOs of the URC team said a very interesting thing to me the other day, which I think is probably true. He said, he's trying to think of a very clever answer how we solve it, but there isn't one. So I think if you look at how players are managed at the moment, NBA, we actually don't have a big issue with regards to the provincial guys. The provinces are managing it very well. What we do is we look at the individual management of the players on an individual level. So we track each and every player to see, do they get their relevant rest in a 12-month period? The downside of that is that your traditional strong teams can't be that strong in all the competitions, and you see that in the Currie Cup. So yes, they've managed the players very well, but they might not be as competitive in the URC and the Currie Cup as they would like to be. So they give a little bit away on performance. Then on a national level, we don't give that much away on performance, but you do have 20 or 25 players that we do struggle to get them in their load guidelines. So on a provincial level, the 12-month calendar is mostly a challenge from a performance perspective for the teams, not so much from a player load. And on a national level, not so much from a performance point of view, but more from a player load, because we do have 20 players or 25 players that we're struggling to. So the only real solution that I can think of is that, or not me, that's already been mooted by a lot of people in the industry, is that we move the Rugby Championship to the Six Nations window, and that we play from middle February until end of March our Rugby Championship, and that we use July and August to basically, or say end of July until the beginning of September, to switch off the lights of the industry completely with all the other industries. And there you've got slam bang, your 8 weeks rest. Because it's not only for players, Emia, that you need the 8-week rest, you also need it for your coaches and your administrative staff, etc. And they can't switch off when the teams are playing. So I think that's the ultimate solution, is to move Rugby Championships to Six Nations.
What is the exact parameters of the players at the moment? How many weeks, how many games are they allowed to play? How many minutes? How does this leave thing work? The 8 weeks consecutive leave and the likes. Just the basics of the nuts and bolts of this, of the basics of any player, individual player.
So a player is not allowed to play more than 32 games in a 12-month cycle. So each player will have his own cycle, and let's say my cycle runs from 1 August to end of July. I'm not allowed to play more than 32 games in that cycle. Anything more than 20 minutes constitute a game, and these days, if you're also in the 23-man squad, that constitutes a game. And then you're not allowed to, you must have an 8-week break, complete break in a 12-month period. And that's basically, of that 8 weeks, 3 weeks must be a complete, what we call beer and braai. So you go away, you're not training or anything. 2 weeks are used for reactivation, and then 3 weeks is sort of a pre-season. And then after that 8-week period, in week 9 or 10, you can start playing again and taking contact.
I spent a lot of time last year talking to Jake White when he was still at the Bulls, and one of the biggest bugbears that he was talking about, and I don't want to use the word bugbear in a negative sense, but something that he had to contend with, according to him, was the fact that a player had to have 8 weeks consecutive leave, non-stop, uninterrupted. Is that true?
That is true. On a provincial level, we do require an 8-week period, and that's just, again, backed by conditioning experts. The levels of inflammation and injuries and what should they put their bodies through. and you will see that the World Rugby guidelines talk about 12 weeks, but that's the minimum period you need the human body to rest, just to recover from everything that it was exposed to over a 10 or 11-month period. I don't disagree that that it's a challenge on a high performance level from a Jake White type of level. It will be a challenge, yes, because so I think that is the point. It's so difficult to balance what's required from a player welfare point of view versus a high performance point of view. And that's where the 12-month calendar is actually exposed us significantly. And that's the other thing, Emir, when we talk and we sit around the table with all the coaches and the CEOs, we're all aligned. We all want the same thing. We all know you can't not look after player welfare. And we all also know that high performance is a significant factor for the industry. We must be able to perform. So we're all aligned. It's just that the solution isn't that easy because we can't create another 2 months and make a year, a 14-month year. That's must be the most elegant solution, but we can't do it. So all aligned, but the challenge is real.
Yeah, I suppose we want the same thing, the best for the players, but there are certain realities. One of those realities are that the Springboks are now playing more and more tests every year. This year it's going to be 15 tests. I think they organized an extra one for Japan, and that actually overlaps with a URC game that wasn't in the coach's original planning. How does that work? And now World Rugby's now come out and said, no, they want 30 weeks. It's just a recommendation at the moment. But I mean, the point is, if the Springboks are going to take up 15 or 30 or 32 weeks, where does that leave the franchises or the unions?
Well, the regulations in there is quite clear on that. The unions or the franchises are not required to release a player for anything that's outside of a Regulation 9 week. Regulation 9 is your traditional test weeks, and currently I think there are 12 of them. So a union or a franchise would be perfectly within their rights not to release a national player for those games. Then, of course, it's up for SARU and the franchise to reach an agreement on terms on how they would like to release that player. But at the moment, SARU is entitled to 12 test matches a year. They can pool the players. The franchise cannot say no, and vice versa. After that 12-week period, the player must play for the franchise. And if he or she plays for the national team, there should be an arrangement in place between SARU and the relevant franchise.
Okay, but that might be a bit difficult to enforce as a union. I mean, you're not going to go against what Rassie Erasmus wants, for example. He wants the Japan game for some reason, some development or player testing or whatever. And if the union says no, how's that going to go off? What's the relationship like between SARU and the unions when it comes to these players being released?
Yeah, look, we're not really involved in the discussions between, say, for example, a URC franchise and SARU when it comes to the release of the players. We're comfortable that they either enforce it if they feel they should, it's in their best interest, or if they're happy to settle with the national coaches and SARU, we're also happy either way. We just advise them, these are your options, guys, and we're all adults here. You need to, within those parameters, solve the issue. But I agree. I'm not trying to say it's always the easiest discussion. I'm sure those discussions are not simple, but that's where the solution lies between SARU and the franchises.
When you're managing your players, there are some unique challenges. The one side of it, some players are playing too much rugby, and a lot of players are not playing enough rugby. For example, Griquas, Cheetahs, Pumas. I mean, how do you balance that? Isn't there a bigger solution to maybe have a bigger player pool that they can draw from? We saw the Lions now going to borrow players from the Griquas and some from the Bulls and the likes. Isn't that maybe a solution going forward to increase the size of the squads? Even if that size squad isn't necessarily in the union, but a pool that they can draw from and actually get these players more game time. Because that is a major problem. You can't have a union like the Pumas, for example, or the Griquas, who are Currie Cup champions this year, playing for 3 or 4 months of the year, and the rest of the time they have to pay the players, but they're not playing.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very good comment you're making. So if we look at our player utilization, so we try and track the player utilization here in the office to understand how the asset is utilized. And we've got a tip of the iceberg that's overutilized. That's the 20 to 25 players that's playing national and URC. Then the sweet spot is our URC players. They're actually very well utilized. We use them quite well. We can utilize them a little bit more, but they are well utilized. And then below that, if you go and look at your teams that's not playing in the URC competitions and they're playing First Division Currie Cup or Currie Cup, they're completely underutilized. That's our view, and we should get more games for them, because if you put those amount of resources around the players with regards to funding, coaching, facilities, etc., they're completely underutilized. So we don't know what the solution is for that, because at the moment it's difficult to find teams or competitions for them, either teams to play against, but also funding to get them into other competitions. So the SA Cup addressed a little bit of that in the beginning of the year, where you had those 10 teams playing a one-round competition against one another. And from a load perspective, that's great, because it ups the load a little bit. But also, from our desks, a player that's completely underutilized is not something that we lie awake about at night. But we are concerned a little bit about what it does for the sustainability of the industry, because you're spending finances on something that you're not utilizing in the way that you should be. But URC is quite sweet. We're happy. And then the national players, those top 15, we need 20. We need a little bit of attention.
Just going back to that top 20, like you just called the top 20, 25 players. Another thing that Jake told me was those players work slightly differently. The returning Springboks don't have that 8-week consecutive thing. They can have 3 weeks here and another week there or something like that. Is that true?
That is true. And the reason why we allow them to break it up is twofold. One is their schedule, because it's difficult to give them a complete 8-week break. But secondly, also a lot of them they understand their bodies very well. They're very experienced, and some of them actually indicated to us, listen, I would prefer to have a 3-week break and then a 2-week break. Players that are a little bit more junior, they're not always that confident in requesting it, and also their understanding of what is required early on in their careers is not so clear. So that's why we make them the stock standard rules apply to them. But if you're a national player, you can break up the 8 weeks, provided your employer agrees with you. That's in your best interest.
Right, now to get to the other side of it, how is this policed? You get a red flag on your spreadsheet there somewhere, some players now being overutilized or whatever. How does that work? Do you get on the phone and say, listen, Johan or John Dobson or whatever, What does it work?
So we track them in the office. We've got a data controller that captures everything, and I must say the provinces are great. They're telling us exactly what's going on their side as well. So together with their input and information that they're giving us, we literally just do an Excel spreadsheet. We share that with them on a monthly basis. And if there is a red tab, which there almost never is, because like I said, they are really brilliant. I don't know how they get it right, but they do get it right. Then we would engage. And again, those engagements are extremely constructive. They always have a very good indication of why the player, might have a red tab, etc. But so together with the provinces and our team, we manage that. And
Do you allow any exceptions? Let's say, for argument's sake, Deon Fourie was injured this past weekend. They're overseas. There is no other player available except one player who might go over the limit a little bit. Is that allowed on a case-by-case basis?
You can go there, but you must be careful, because otherwise you'll get a case by case every week at every province. So ideally, the rule of thumb is no, we don't allow it. But if a guy is on game 32 and he's playing in the URC final the next week, the player will tell us, listen, I'm firing you all if you don't allow me to play in that final. So you have to have common sense, for example, but the rule of thumb is no, it's not allowed.
All right. Now, there's the player well-being has got, I think, in my mind, two sides to it. The one is the actual physical, the hamstring or a knee or whatever. The other side is the recurring head injuries and the long-term effects of these recurring head injuries. What's your stance on preventing those kind of things? Yeah, head injuries specifically.
I think it's controlled 100% by World Rugby, and SA Rugby as custodians of the game, So I think our role is to engage with them and put as much as possible pressure on them to be aware of this and do everything and anything they can for the game to make sure that players are safe. And on that note, I have to say I've attended a few of their conferences, and India, I'm blown away by the amount of work and research that's being done by World Rugby with regards to concussion, head injuries, etc. So again, as a players' association, I can nothing but commend them. I think it is clear that it's a very high priority on their agenda, and no costs and energy is saved in terms of analyzing it, doing research. So we're very comfortable where they are at the moment. Of course, we can't comment for what the situation was 20 years ago. I think there's a lot of talk in that space. But where World Rugby and SA Rugby is at the moment, also the implementation of instrumented mouth guards made a big difference, and that's also information that we monitor on a daily basis. So still a lot of things that we don't know, but it's certainly not because of a lack of trying to know. It's just, I think it's a developing topic.
You mentioned the mouth guards. You said you're monitoring. That was going to be my next question. Do you monitor the minutes of these players that have suffered concussions and the likes? Because I think that should be more carefully monitored, maybe, than physical injury. Maybe do you actually monitor that closely?
Yeah, so a player that's undergone a head injury will be monitored. There will be a return to play procedure that the player goes through, and if he or she fails it, there will be the rest period or the rehabilitation period will be extended in terms of the guidelines. So carefully monitored if there's a head injury or concussion and when the player can return to contact. Yes.
What is that protocol, the return to play? We saw Marcel Coetzee staying behind, for example. How does it work? How many weeks do they have to sit out? The minimum, and then it gets reevaluated. How does that work?
I'll have to. You mostly have to get one of the team doctors on here to get the details. But I know on the day there's a test, a mental test that they go through, and that's followed up by further tests during the week. And I think the minimum period if you fail your test is a 12-day period, but I'm under correction here. And if you then don't meet the progressive requirements, then you won't be allowed to take contact, and that the team doctor will keep on monitoring the player in terms of those protocols until he or she is comfortable that the player can now return. And that's why a guy like Marcel is not allowed to go. I think we had Eben with the same thing in the semi-final of the URC last year. He didn't get through I've got no doubt if you ask a guy like Eben to play in the semi-final of the URC, he would have been in front of the line, running out on the field, but those procedures obviously kept him out.
I'm quite an avid Formula One follower, and one of their rules are that beginning of the August holidays, summer holidays, you have to close up your factory, and you're not allowed to touch a computer or anything, not even send emails. It's monitored very, very closely by the FIA and enforced, like you just mentioned. That's what you're working towards. Is there a similar procedure, something that you learn from other sports that you use as an example to manage this kind of thing?
Yeah, I think from a player load perspective, we look at what the NFL and Major League Baseball and those guys are doing, but they are unique. They are unique in the sense that they only operate in a national environment. So the commercials, they don't have international commercials to be concerned about, which is something we do have, and that makes it they can control their season a little bit easier. But we do look at it. The other thing about rugby is it's so unique, and it's such an exclusive and a niche sport. So the thing that we would normally focus on is to get the right people on committees with their relevant expertise and give them the ample time to advise, to first research and then to advise us what to do, just because rugby is so unique in here. And so we look at other sports, but still we're very unique when it comes to, the type of injuries and, what we're exposed to.
I'm interested in the NFL angle because I know that that's probably one of the most almost micromanaged sports in the world, and also a very physical game, lots of injuries, so I suppose ACLs and LCLs and all those kinds of things as well. Why is it so different to rugby, do you think? Where is it different?
Well, I think it's different in the sense that they wear protective gear. I think it starts there a little bit. I think the fact that we haven't had mostly as many head rules around head injuries and concussion. It was slightly different. I think they caught onto that maybe a little bit earlier. But the type of contact that you see on the field is also different. Ours is very controlled. Theirs is a little bit less controlled, but they do have padding preventing them, etc. So we're not in that space, and I haven't seen in detailed studies where they actually do analysis on the type of injuries that they incur on a seasonal basis versus rugby, and that will be a very interesting stat to see, no doubt.
Let's just get back to the Currie Cup briefly and the SA Cup. SA Cup was, it fizzled out, let's call it what it was. I mean, didn't even have proper touch judges, and there was no TMOs. A lot of the coaches that I spoke to were not happy with the format of the SA Cup. And part of the reason for the SA Cup was to give these players more time. But shouldn't the focus be, from a player management perspective as well, to maybe focus more on the Currie Cup, maybe make that a double round, because it is a more prestigious, and it is in danger of sort of fizzling out and being relegated to history, rather than the SA Cup. I know what you're saying, the SA Cup is so many minutes, the Currie Cup is so many minutes, but shouldn't the Currie Cup be prioritized above a sort of a newbie competition like the SA Cup, the Currie Cup with all its prestige and history behind it?
Yeah, I don't have all the answers, but I do think the Currie Cup is a little bit in an identity crisis. And the reason why I'm saying it is because the prestige we attach to it comes from an era where we didn't have Test Rugby or EPCR or URC. What has happened in the meanwhile, since we created this Currie Cup prestige back in the 80s or early 90s, is we added 3 competitions effectively on top of that, URC, EPCR, and Test Match Rugby Championship, and those things. So I think we would be lying to ourselves as an industry to say the prestigiousness of the Currie Cup did not dilute. It diluted significantly. We diluted it. Yes, it diluted, and we gained a lot by diluting it. We gained URC participation, EPCR, and Test Match Rugby. I don't know what the answer is, but we need to be realistic about that and reposition the Currie Cup completely in accordance with that. That's sort of my feeling.
You mentioned the EPCR, and that's the Champions Cup and the Challenge Cup. And one of the challenges that the unions are facing in South Africa is getting South African audiences or crowds to be excited about Bordeaux coming to Loftus. Bordeaux won the Champions Cup last year, effectively the best or the second best club rugby team in the world, maybe just behind Toulouse and the likes. That's a competition just not caught the imagination of anybody. And isn't it maybe a clever plan not to play in that competition, rather just play in the URC, rest the players a bit more, and then manage the loads that way?
From our perspective, Emia, and again, I know there are commercials behind it, which I don't understand, but from our perspective, we would agree with that 100%. It would help with load because it would open up 5 or 6 critical weekends that we need. And secondly, I think it will make it much easier for the fan. I take my mother, she's got no idea why they're playing EPCR one weekend and URC the other weekend. And it is difficult to understand. In Europe, it worked because they've done it for 30 years and those countries are very close to one another. So everyone will know where France is, and it's nice to have a European interconnection game every now and again. So it works there. And I think it's a European Cup. And it should stay a European Cup. If the commercials allow us, we would be very comfortable to withdraw from that and just play in the URC.
I wonder if that's sort of part and parcel of the URC agreement, that you have to play in Europe. I'd be interested to hear that. One last question that I forgot to ask you earlier on. It's a bit of a wild Wednesday. The match thing, you briefly mentioned that 20 minutes counts as a match. So a guy coming on for 10 minutes, cameo here or cameo there, that doesn't count as a match. It has to be 20 minutes. And does that now get added 10 minutes here and there, 10 minutes there, gives you 20 minutes, that counts as one match? How does that work?
No, it will normally be, and I'm speaking under correction, but if you play for more than 20 minutes in a match, that will count as a match, and you can't play for more than 32 matches. But if you just sit on the bench and you don't come on, that will count as an involvement, and you're not allowed more than 35 involvements in a year.
Okay, so even if it's 10 minutes or what, that still counts as an involvement if it's below 20. So there's still a cap to it. That's quite interesting because the guy, you still have to, train and everything else. All right, this is fascinating.
That's for the mental break. That's for the mental break, to ensure that the guy doesn't sit on the bench for 40 weeks and he never gets a mental break. So after 35 involvements, you're not allowed to use him any further.
Well, define a mental break for me. I'm interested to hear that.
Mental break is the beer and braai. We want the player to get away, like we all do in December holidays, and just to be able not even really have a formal schedule that he or she have to follow. Look, you're a professional sports person. You will still have to train at some level, but at least if you can get off official program for 3 weeks, have a beer and braai, or do whatever it is what you do for fun, at least for 3 weeks, do that, and then you can start training again and getting back into the system. We hope that's enough, but a lot of the CEOs are saying something that's very true. They say these days we look after the physical part of the player actually not too badly, but we don't understand what we're doing mentally with them by playing for 12 months.
You mentioned 3 weeks. If it's a beer and braai mental break for 35 involvements, it's only a 3 weeks break then, not 8 weeks.
So the 8 weeks is broken up into a 3-week beer and braai.
Mm.
After that, 2 weeks reactivation, which is actually training, light training, and then a 3-week pre-season. Yeah.
So it's still 8 weeks. It's still 8 weeks, even if it's just 35 involvements, not 32 games. It's still 8 weeks.
Still 8 weeks now.
I tell you what, these coaches have to work cut out for them. I mean, this must be so difficult. Johan Ackerman said the other day, the Springboks must play fewer tests because it's making his life too difficult now. Like you said, with the 15 tests, and it makes, suddenly he had his players available for 32 minus 12, like you just said, he had 20 weeks. Now it's coming down to maybe 15 weeks if this World Rugby thing is, becomes a regulation. And then that becomes a problem for the unions who have to pay these guys. And not having them at their full disposal. Isn't that an issue going forward?
Again, I would think that's something for the unions and SARU to have a discussion around it. I'm not, although we see it, there's a lot of those players, there's a dual contribution by SARU and the province, and they will have to go and look at, this is the contribution. Is it fair that I don't have that player for those 2 games? And, have that discussion. Of course, a player would like to play for the national team. There's no doubt. And so I think all of those that can be solved by communication between SARU and the relevant URC team. But it's not. In saying that, I also understand that the coaches might say, "Listen." I think any coach will say, "Listen, if I lose the player for another 2 or 3 additional games, it's not the ideal."
The problem is his hands are tied behind his back. He's only got 56 or 57 players at his disposal. So if the Springboks are not available, you're down to 40, 45, maybe minus injuries, then it becomes a bit of a juggling act. And I'm still wondering about that squad size, if that's not maybe a long-term solution, getting a bigger pool, sort of a common pool that all the unions can draw from as and when they need to, to get those other players a bit of a bigger opportunity to play, more playing time.
Well, to put that in perspective, our squad sizes are bigger than Ireland and the squad sizes in England. So our squad sizes allowed is bigger than Leinster. Leinster is sitting with 22 international players.
Mm. How do they manage that then? What's wrong with us? Why can't we manage with our 56?
Exactly. That's the question. And that's a great question. They're sitting with obviously a big group of junior players that they use very well. And they do that planning. And also, if you take our salary cap, if you take the South African salary cap at the moment in rand, and you convert that to pounds, it's the same as the salary cap in London, except that your cost of living in London is 2.2 times more expensive than living in South Africa. So effectively, our salary cap is much higher than the Premiership.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. Glad we got to this one now, because that was one of the biggest issues. That the salary cap is 85, but I think it ends up at 130 million if you take into consideration the money that SARU is contributing and everything else. So that's not really an issue. I just don't get it. So Leinster uses their juniors better than our franchises are doing, because I know the Bulls, for example, sitting with plenty of juniors that are never getting a chance, and they eventually just sort of fade away. Is that part of the problem?
I wouldn't say they're using it better. What I'm saying is they've got less senior players, and they've got less senior players, and they've got a group of 22. Now I'm talking on last year's stats, because I haven't seen the stats for this year. But last year they had less contracted senior players than what we allow for URC teams in South Africa, and they had the most international players at one team, and they were top of the lot. 22 players in that squad that played for Ireland in the year.
Well, there's 2 sides to that, yeah. Sorry. The one is who pays the salaries, and the Central Union pays their salaries, not the.
But if you talk about availability of players, they had less availability of players, and they still managed to perform. So that's saying to us that it can be done. It's not, and Leinster have been in the past 30 years. They've been fairly successful in the EPCR as well in terms of being competitive. They play well in both competitions. And again, we're not saying it's easy, but it's being done. So from what we see, we don't think squad sizes is an issue, and we also don't think the salary cap is an issue. The reason why we like the squad sizes and why we like the salary cap, of course, is sustainability. It ensures that we've got a little bit of sustainability in the industry, because your salaries is almost 60% of your expense. And why we like the squad cap is ensure that players play, that you don't sit with players that's not playing. And it's good for the player's career to know that I'm going to get a run on, as opposed to having these big squads that we had in 2017, and the utilization of the players are very low. So it's bad from a financial point of view, but it's also bad from a career development point of view. And that's why we as an organization actually like the salary cap and the player caps.
That's interesting. Do you guys then determine the salary cap? That's part of your negotiation, the salary cap and the squad size.
Yeah, I always say to someone, it's like asking someone to dance with you, like asking a girl to dance with you. If she says no, there's nothing you can do. You walk away, and then the agreement on the salary cap and the squad size is exactly the same. So we do it together. If they say no, they don't want to do it, then we'll walk away. Then we'll say, okay, that's fine. You're the employer, but we're happy to do the research with them, and we're happy to constructively engage with them because we feel it's very important to have it. And the reason why we've taken that stance is because of all the liquidations that we've seen in rugby. So we started taking that stance in 2017 to say, this is 60% of the cost. Let's try and manage it as well as possible. And when we introduced the salary cap in 2017, salaries came down in 2022 to about, we did bring it down with about 150, 160 million in total. And with the relaxation of the salary caps in 2 years, we took all that ground back again, and lost those savings. So it's not an easy topic, and it's not as simplistic as I'm mostly talking about it, but I think there is a lot of the work for the industry in that topic, and that if we do get it right, it can be very beneficial for us as an industry.
One of the biggest differences in South African rugby compared to other unions like New Zealand and Australia is now relaxed as well. South African players play all over the world, and they still get selected for the Springboks. Do you represent those players as well, the guys playing in Japan or playing in France or whatever, or are they on their own?
We do, while they play for the national team. So our mandate as a business is we can represent players that play professionally for South African teams. So then we represent you. And our view is, MBA, that it's great. The fact while players go overseas is, one, for career development, two, to see the world, but three, and most importantly, mostly financial gain. The reason why they get better financial gain is because of our exchange rate. And that's not something that rugby can fix. That's something that's on a government level. So for us to pretend that we can fix it and not pick those guys, who are we fooling? So we can't fix that. So rather work with the problem and bring them in. We score a lot on intellectual property because they play in those other environments. They understand the European environment and the Japanese players. So that's a tick box for us. A lot of their salaries is actually funded by the overseas clubs. They're subsidizing a big portion of our game. And then thirdly, those slots go open on the URC level, and we can develop new players in those slots. So I really don't see on which level it doesn't work for us as a country. New Zealand and Australia might be unique because they don't have the exchange challenges that we have, and maybe they do have the funding to keep those players. I don't know, but I do think what they have done, Saru and Rassie, in that policy is genius. It worked for us, and I can't see a reason why we shouldn't use it.
Is there not a danger of diluting the local competitions? You just mentioned how they go overseas, so that opens up the space in the URC maybe for some other player to come through. But is it reality? Is it realistic to think that can happen? Is there enough talent in South Africa? I mean, we have many rugby players, thousands of them. But does it mean that necessarily we have the talent necessarily to fill those gaps?
Well, if you look at the stats, I think we played in 3 Super Rugby finals in 24 years. We played in all the URC finals in 4 years when we had that policy. So definitely from a provincial level, it doesn't show because we've played in 100% of the finals. I don't know how much better you want to do than that, But the Super Rugby we played in 4. We had, I think, the Lions 2 or 3 times and the Bull 2 times or 3 times, and in finals. So we didn't really, when we had all the players playing in South Africa on a provincial level, it did not really equate to that much success, and how many times did we win Super Rugby? I think the Bulls won it in 2007 and 2010.
And 9, 3 times. Yeah, won 3 times.
3 times. 3 times. And and we already won 1 URC title in 4 tries, and played in all the finals. So I'm not saying it does not impact on us, but the early signs are that we're okay.
Is it not maybe an indication that the URC is a weaker competition than Super Rugby as a matter of interest?
Again, that's a good question. But if you go and look at since we played in the URC, we've won the British Irish Lions, we've won 2 rugby championships, and we've won a World Cup. Again, I don't think we've had a 4-year period like that. It doesn't look like a performance is going down. So I think the fact that the URC is a weaker competition is a perception that we might have had while we were only playing in Super Rugby, but it doesn't show on the results. It seems like the national team is still fairly competitive, and the sevens team and the ladies team is making a lot of progress. So I think the URC game has been a gift for South African rugby if you look at performance.
Well, what I think is it opened new worlds for us in terms of our rivals. Suddenly, Irish are now our rivals. When Ireland plays South Africa, we actually know who they are. We know who their good players are. We sort of have a feeling about, Caelan Doris. We know who he is. He beat the Bulls, and I like that side of it. That opened up new horizons almost. French, for example, but it's not in the URC. But yeah, it widened the scope of rugby. But the point is, I'm with you. What, like we said right in the beginning of this conversation, was the Rugby Championship in the current time slot is not sustainable. Now it looks like it's going to fall away altogether, maybe. Nobody knows if it's going to come back or be played again. Is it going to go back to tours, All Blacks this year, the Springboks in 4 years' time, and then it's Australia and Argentina? What's the future there, do you think, in terms of going forward?
I think they've got a good balance now. My understanding is that they will have the greatest rugby rivalry every 4 years. And then, then you've got a World Cup year. So in those 2 years, you've got a shortened version of the Rugby Championship. And in the other 2 years, you've got the full version. And I think that's a nice balance. I think that's most probably about right. In terms of the demand, I think there's a demand for the longer tours between the All Blacks and the Springboks. And then there's also a demand to have the longer Rugby Championships in the other 2 years. So I think that balance that they've got now is most probably a better balance. And also to play the same type of competition, Rugby Championship, in the same format every year, maybe that's not necessary, So it will be interesting, Emvia, to see where it goes and how Greatest Rugby rivalry is received after we've played the full cycle, 1 year and 1 there. I guess after that we will know, but we're very welcoming, and we also think that it's a great commercial initiative by the parties, to explore these new avenues and see what we can do. But just on that's what the URC competition was also great for South African rugby, because if you think about it from a commercial point of view, the moment we played Super Rugby in South Africa, Australia and New Zealand was sleeping, and vice versa. So your eyeballs, 50% of your eyeballs is closed when you actually have a commercial activation, and where now all the eyeballs are open when you have your commercial activation. So I think from that perspective, URC is definitely easier traveling in terms of time zones. It's definitely commercially, it's got a lot of opportunity, and thirdly, it looks from a performance perspective that it served us well so far.
Well, it doesn't solve the problem of the time slots. How realistic do you think the moving of the championship to overlap with the Six Nations going forward is? I'm asking this question, for example, New Zealand only play Super Rugby later in the season. They would typically play it then, which means they will have to go into a championship without having a Super Rugby season before that. South Africa would have been playing in the URC for a couple of months by then. Is that a realistic option, moving it to that time slot?
I know that I'm not sure about Argentina and Australia, but I know that New Zealand, they like to rest the international players after their November tour, and rightly so. They had a significant load by them. And if they do bring them back mid-January, it's just too little time, like you say, Emvia, to get them ready for the mid-February test matches. So if we can maybe start a week later, or there could be an arrangement with those players to rest a little bit less, then I do think it's workable. But having said that, if you look at the bigger picture, I think the world is moving into a direction of a one calendar, and at the end of the day, all of us will have to make it work, even if it means that maybe Six Nations have to move a week or two, or South African rugby need to move a week or two. I think we would be lying to ourselves if we don't understand the global direction of travel on this. I think we will have to have an aligned calendar, meaning Six Nations and the Rugby Championship are played at the same time.
I think that will be ideal. It'll be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'll be the best solution. I'm just wondering, like I said, about the practicalities of it. And, lots of local interest-taking presidents. For example, New Zealand doesn't want to do this and Australia doesn't want to do that. I don't want to juggle all those balls. I'll tell you what, I think it must be quite tough. Anyway, thank you, Eugene. I appreciate your time. And sorry for wondering about my questions a little bit, but I appreciate you making time for me.
Not at all. It was great chatting, Emir. Thanks for inviting us.